I still remember the exact moment my life felt like it cracked open for good. It was late March 2025, a Thursday night, and I was standing in the middle of our bedroom, the one place I thought was untouchable, sacred even. The smell of her perfume lingered in the air, sweet and familiar, the scent that had once made me feel at home. And there, on the bed, in the place where I had slept beside her for nearly a decade, I saw it, the evidence that shattered the last threads of my trust. I didn't even need to touch it, to question it. My stomach knotted, my heart slammed against my ribs, and I felt my chest go icy cold. She had crossed every line, every boundary I thought was unbreakable. She had slept with him. In our home. In our bed. I'm Michael Adams, 38, living in Portland, Oregon, though I grew up just outside Boston, in a neighborhood that smelled of snow in the winters and freshly cut grass in the summers. I'm the kind of guy who believed in fairness, in patience, in showing up for people even when it hurt me. I worked in IT consulting, a 9-to-5 routine sprinkled with occasional late nights, and I liked it that way, predictable, steady, comfortable. That predictability extended to my personal life too. I was married to Julia, my wife, for 8 years. We have 2 kids, Lucy, 7, and Max, 5, who made my life feel chaotic in the best ways. I thought we had a solid life. I thought we were partners. I thought love was enough. But I had started noticing cracks years ago, small things I tried to ignore. Late-night texts she'd laugh at quietly on her phone, sudden defensiveness over minor topics, the way she avoided my eyes sometimes when we talked about our finances or future plans. Nothing seemed overt, nothing I could confront without sounding paranoid, and I chalked it up to stress, to parenting, to work pressures. I didn't want to believe that something darker could be brewing right under my nose. I wanted to believe in us. For a long time, I did everything I could to hold us together. I covered more than my share of bills, took the kids to soccer practice, stayed up late helping with homework, and even tried to schedule us time, dinners, movie nights, anything to reconnect. I thought showing up, being present, would be enough, and for a while it was. But I had started sensing she was slipping away. It wasn't the big betrayals yet, just small red flags that kept me awake at night. She would mention a friend a lot, more than seemed normal. She started dressing differently, more carefully, like she wanted attention beyond my gaze. I remember the first time I got that pit in my stomach, the same pit that would later become a permanent ache, was back in 20. She came home one evening smelling like someone else's cologne. I laughed it off, asked if she'd been around a client, but the unease stayed with me. I remember thinking, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe it's nothing. But nothing stayed nothing. Fast forward to early 2025, and I had the creeping suspicion confirmed, though I didn't want to admit it. Julia had been seeing someone else, an AP, as I would later call him. At first it was emotional, small secret messages, excuses for being unavailable, little lies I caught but chose to ignore. I wasn't done with her, not really. Even when I found traces of her emotional affair, I kept helping, kept forgiving, kept showing up. I thought maybe this was a phase, a mistake she'd regret. I wanted to believe in redemption, in love, in us. I remember the night it all turned physical, as though it had been etched into my memory by fire. I had come home later than usual, because I stayed at the office to finish a project. The house was quiet, eerily so. I remember stepping into our bedroom, flipping the light on, and seeing him, her AP, lying there in the bed we had shared for years. I froze, my brain refusing to process the betrayal at first. My hands shook, my breath came fast, and the reality hit me like a hammer. Julia, my wife, the person I had trusted above anyone else, had slept with another man in our home, in the place where I thought safety, love, and intimacy was sacred. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, at least not immediately. I just stood there, my mind racing, replaying every interaction I had ignored, every small lie I had rationalized. I remembered the fights over finances, the arguments where she blew up at me, the nights when I felt our connection slip. That same night she had fought with me about money, Sharp words exchanged, tempers flaring, and then she went and crossed the line. The smell, the sheets, the lingering scent of perfume, it all became evidence, proof that the life I had been holding onto so desperately was a lie. And yet even after that night, I didn't give up. I kept showing up, kept trying. I told myself maybe she would come back, that maybe love could survive this, that maybe she would see what she had done and return. I wanted to believe in. I remember the moments of quiet reflection in the days that followed, when I would sit in our kitchen sipping coffee, watching Lucy and Max fight over toys, and feel this sick, heavy weight in my chest. I would hear Julia moving around the house, laughing, talking, and part of me hated her, and part of me still loved her. I couldn't reconcile those feelings. I wondered how someone could betray the very person who loved them, who had given everything to keep the family intact, and yet still expect forgiveness so easily. She didn't just betray me, she rewrote the rules of our marriage, the foundation of trust I had spent years building. And even now, when she reaches out crying, saying she wants to fix things, part of me can't get past the timing. Why now? Why after she got what she wanted? Why after reality caught up with her? I replay that night endlessly, in my head, imagining every moment, every touch, every look that she gave him in our home. The intimacy that should have been ours was stolen, and no amount of words could undo it. I began documenting everything. I saved messages, screenshots, little notes she left, all of it adding to the undeniable truth that she chose him over me when it mattered most. And yet when I look at her now, when she writes me a note, when she cries on the phone saying she doesn't want a divorce, part of me is torn. There's love, there's history, there's the family we've built, but there's also betrayal, timing, and a wound that cuts so deep, I can't even enter our home without thinking of him. And this tension, this unbearable mixture of love, hate, hope, and heartbreak, is where my story truly begins. This is the world I was living in when I decided that I had to confront, not just the betrayal, but my own limits, my own capacity to forgive, to endure, to hope. It's where every ordinary day, every mundane moment, became a battlefield of memory and emotion, and where I began to realize that sometimes, knowing the truth is both a curse and a revelation. The story isn't about revenge yet, and it isn't about closure. It's about understanding the fracture, the moment when everything changed, and the realization that even when you show up, even when you try to hold on, people and love can fail you in ways you never imagined. And standing in that bedroom, with the scent of betrayal thick in the air, I understood something fundamental about myself. I wasn't ready to give up, but I also couldn't remain the same person I had been. That night I became someone else, someone forced to confront every uncomfortable truth I had avoided, someone about to embark on a journey that would test every fiber of my being. It started like any other evening, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I had gone out to meet a client for a last-minute project discussion, promising Julia I'd be back before the kids went to bed. I remember thinking, as I drove through the drizzle-soaked streets of Portland, that March night, that everything felt unusually quiet, almost too quiet. My instincts buzzed, a low hum I tried to ignore. Maybe it was just fatigue, the stress of work, or the gnawing anxiety that had been building since I first noticed her distant behavior. When I pulled into the driveway, my car's tires crunching against the gravel, I noticed the lights in the living room were off. That was normal. The kids were asleep, and she was probably scrolling on her phone as she often did. I grabbed my briefcase, closed the door behind me, and started up the stairs. The moment I reached the landing outside our bedroom, a strange silence settled over me. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of something unspoken. I should have left right there. I should have turned around, walked back to the car and driven away. But I didn't. I stepped inside, flicked on the light and froze. There he was, her AP, sprawled across the sheets of our bed, the bed we had chosen together, the bed where we had comforted each other through illnesses, heartbreaks, and sleepless nights with newborns. And she, my wife, was there too, in the same bed. My stomach turned violently, my throat went dry. I felt the blood drain from my face as if my body was trying to protect me from the horror I had just witnessed. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My mind raced, moving too fast for my body to keep up. Questions tore through me like shards of glass. How long had this been going on? How could she, my wife, allow this in our home, in our bed, in the sanctuary of our family? My hands clenched into fists. I felt heat rising to my chest, my vision narrowing, yet I couldn't look away. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to leave, to flee, to escape the betrayal that had become flesh and blood before my eyes. After what felt like hours, though it could only have been seconds, I found the courage, or maybe the numbness, to move. I went to the dresser and started pulling out the items that would serve as proof: discarded clothing, receipts, messages I had ignored or rationalized. I documented everything. My fingers shook. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break my ribcage. I felt a deep, visceral anger, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes your hands shake even when your mind is screaming for reason. Even then, part of me wanted to understand. Part of me wanted to find some rational explanation, some excuse I could accept. Maybe it was a mistake, a lapse, a moment of weakness, but deep down I knew better. I had seen the signs, felt the distance, heard the half-lies and evasions. She had chosen him over me, not in some abstract emotional sense, but physically, intimately, in the very place where our family's love had been supposed to reside. I left the house that night without saying a word. I drove aimlessly, windows down, letting the cold March air slash across my face, cutting through the fog of disbelief and pain that had settled over me. I remember the sound of the windshield wipers, the rhythmic swoosh against the glass, and the silence in the car, broken only by the occasional whimper of my own contained sobs. I didn't call anyone. I didn't go to a bar. I didn't even consider confronting her right. I just drove, hoping movement could somehow distance me from the memory etched into my mind. The next morning, I woke in a friend's spare room. Sleep hadn't come, but exhaustion had forced a shallow, restless. My mind immediately returned to that scene. The smell of her perfume mixed with the unfamiliar scent of his cologne, the way her body had been in his arms, the intimacy that should have been ours. Every detail haunted me, every image replayed like a looped, torturous movie. I thought about the kids, Lucy and Max, blissfully unaware of the fracture in the foundation of their home. I thought about our parents, our families, the friends who trusted us as a unit. I thought about myself, about who I had been: loyal, patient, forgiving, hopeful. And I realized, in that icy, sobering clarity, that all of that had been taken, manipulated, and shattered without remorse. The following days were a blur of controlled chaos. I didn't confront her yet, because part of me was still trying to hold on to something I knew was gone. I checked my emails obsessively, hoping for a misstep, a message that would give me insight, confirmation, or even closure. Every text I had once ignored or rationalized became a piece of a puzzle I was now desperately trying to complete. I replayed every conversation in my head, every dinner where her smile had felt distant, every laugh that didn't reach her eyes. I started seeing patterns, subtle at first, then undeniable, and then came the note. It was left on the kitchen counter in her handwriting, delicate yet heavy with emotion. She spoke of wanting to fix things, of quitting her job, of returning to what we had. The timing was impeccable, and infuriating. She had gotten what she wanted from him: the intimacy, the attention, the love she claimed she couldn't get from me, and only now, after I had begun to remove myself, to reclaim my own life, did she reach out. My chest tightened reading her words. I felt a strange mix of anger, longing, and disbelief. I started questioning everything: my love, her love, the very nature of trust. How could someone betray so completely and then expect forgiveness on their own schedule? How could I reconcile the history we had shared with the reality of her choices? Every hug, every touch, every shared glance became suspect. I imagined him there, giving what she had withheld from me, and a wave of nausea mixed with rage swept over me. For days I existed in a strange limbo. I went to work, presented a normal facade, laughed with colleagues, but my mind was elsewhere, counting, cataloging, remembering. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, couldn't be near our home without reliving the horror. Every object, every room, every scent became a trigger. I felt like I was trapped in a house full of ghosts: the ghost of our love, the ghost of her betrayal, and the ghost of who I had been before it all. I found myself questioning my own judgment. Had I ignored too many signs? Had I failed to see the cracks before they became chasms? And yet, even in this devastation, part of me refused to give up entirely. I wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. There was a stubborn, almost foolish hope that she might truly regret it, that she might come back fully, that the family we had built could somehow survive the storm. But the breaking point was absolute: seeing the physical reality of her betrayal, knowing she had chosen him in our home, with our bed as the witness. That moment had changed me. It had shifted something fundamental in my being. Love was no longer uncomplicated. Trust was no longer implicit. Hope was no longer innocent. I was left with fragments of everything I had believed, everything I had held dear, scattered across the floor of my own home. And yet in the wreckage, I noticed a strange clarity. I could see the patterns, the choices, the lies. I understood the difference between her love and his, the difference between fleeting desire and commitment. I realized that moving forward would require a reckoning, not just with her, but with myself, my limits, and the moral boundaries I had once taken for granted. That night, and the weeks that followed, I began to plan, not for revenge yet, but for survival. I began to understand the raw, essential truth of betrayal. It doesn't just hurt you emotionally, it rewires your perception. It forces you to confront the parts of yourself you had ignored, and it challenges every assumption you had about love and loyalty. I felt every emotion at once: rage, grief, disbelief, sorrow, and an almost absurd stubbornness that refused to let the situation define me entirely. I knew that what she had done could never be unseen, never be forgiven casually, and never be ignored. And I knew, deep in my bones, that my next steps would define not just the outcome of this relationship, but who I was going to become in its aftermath. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It wasn't like a single wave crashing over me and then receding. It was slow, insidious, creeping into every corner of my life, infecting routines I had once taken for granted. Even weeks after that night, I would wake up and see the light coming through the blinds and think, not about the day ahead, but about him, about her, AP, and my stomach would twist into knots. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. I couldn't look at Julia without imagining every stolen moment between them. And the house, once a sanctuary, became a minefield. Every room held memories of intimacy, laughter, arguments, reconciliations, and now, betrayal. Work became both a refuge and a torment. I threw myself into projects, stayed late, immersed myself in code and client meetings, but my mind was never free. Emails and reports blurred into one another, because I couldn't concentrate. Every ping of a message made me flinch, half expecting it to be her, or worse, him, reminding me of what had happened. My colleagues noticed. I smiled and laughed like I always did, but there was a hollow in my eyes they couldn't see, a tension beneath my calm exterior. The kids noticed too eventually. Lucy started asking questions in her 7-year-old way. Why I looked sad sometimes, why Julia and I seemed to argue more, why I sometimes disappeared for hours. Max was too young to articulate it, but the way he clung to me, the way he sometimes refused to go to bed, made it clear he could sense the tension. That broke me more than anything. I realized that while Julia and I were entangled in this adult drama of betrayal, it was the children who were paying the real price. They hadn't done anything wrong, yet they were forced to navigate a household fractured by secrets and lies. Julia, meanwhile, oscillated between remorse and defensiveness. She would apologize in tears one minute, then snap at me over minor things the next. I couldn't read her, and that terrified me more than anything. I found myself walking on eggshells, unsure which version of her I would encounter each day. The note she left, promising to quit her job and work on us, felt both like a lifeline and a trap. I wanted to believe her, desperately, but the memory of that night was a persistent shadow that refused to be ignored. I started questioning my own instincts. Had I ignored the signs for too long? Was I naive for trusting her so completely? The more I analyzed, the more I realized that I had been complicit in a way. I had chosen hope over reality, denial over confrontation, and patience over accountability. And now, I was paying the price for that choice. The nights were the worst. Alone in a hotel room after moving out, I would replay every moment of that night, every nuance of her body language, every look exchanged between them. Sleep became impossible. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and reach for my phone, half expecting to see a message from her, a confession, an apology, or even a sign that this nightmare was over. Nothing came except the silence, and my own racing thoughts. I started isolating myself, cutting off friends and extended family. I didn't want to explain, to justify, to relive it over and over. Every interaction required me to put on a mask, and I was exhausted from pretending. Yet I couldn't fully escape either. Julia and I still shared responsibilities, still had to coordinate school drop-offs, medical appointments, birthdays. Every encounter was a collision of past intimacy and present betrayal. I felt like I was living two lives simultaneously, the one where I was a husband, a father, a partner, and the one where I was a man betrayed,
humiliated, and forced to confront the worst side of human nature. I thought about revenge at times, but it didn't feel right. I didn't want to sink to her level, didn't want to destroy everything in a fit of anger. Instead, I tried to channel my energy into reclaiming control over myself. I started running early mornings, pounding the pavement through the fog and drizzle, letting the cold wind cut through the anger and grief. I wrote in journals, sometimes incoherently, sometimes painfully precise, cataloging every memory, every emotion, every nuance of the betrayal. I needed a record, a way to understand it, to process it, to eventually make sense of the chaos. I saw a therapist, tentatively at first, unsure if anyone could understand the depth of what I felt. Talking about it aloud, naming it, gave it. Hearing myself say the words, "She slept with him in our bed," was almost unbearable, yet necessary. It crystallized reality. It made the fantasy of hope fragile, but also gave me a strange, brutal clarity. I was not going crazy. I was not imagining things. This had happened, and it had changed everything. I found myself replaying the moments leading up to the betrayal endlessly. The fights over money, the nights she spent working late, the little excuses she made when I tried to every small interaction that once seemed trivial now loomed like a warning sign I had ignored. The clarity was painful, but it was also grounded. I realized that the real fallout wasn't just the physical act, it was the erosion of trust, the shattering of my sense of reality, the destabilization of my home. There were moments of anger I couldn't contain. I would imagine confronting him, seeing him embarrassed, humiliated, paying for what he had done. I fantasized about telling Julia exactly what I felt in that instant, the betrayal, the hurt, the anger that had no words. But then I would pause, take a breath, and remember the children. I couldn't let my impulses destroy the little stability they had left. I had to be careful for them, for my own sanity, for a future that was still uncertain. Financially, the fallout was brutal too. I had to separate accounts, move money, hire lawyers, start untangling a life that had been built under the assumption of trust. Every transaction, every decision, reminded me that the life I had known was gone. I was living in a liminal space, neither fully married, nor fully free, suspended in this gray zone of betrayal and unresolved emotion. The hardest part, though, was emotional. I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I could summon on demand. I realized that hope, even when fueled by love, could be both a strength and a vulnerability. I loved Julia, yes, but that love was entangled with resentment, fear, grief, and disbelief. I couldn't touch her without seeing him in the shadows of our shared history. I couldn't hear her apologize without imagining the moments she had chosen him, even when she cried on the phone, saying she wanted to fix things, promising that she would quit her job, promising she would make us whole again. I felt nothing but conflict. Part of me wanted to believe her, part of me wanted to rage at her for the timing, for the betrayal, for the sheer audacity of expecting forgiveness now. I was trapped between wanting to preserve the family and wanting to protect my own heart, and yet I kept showing up in small ways. I helped with the kids, I answered her messages when necessary, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but every act of care was tinged with caution, every word measured against the knowledge of what had happened. The fallout wasn't just about what she had done, it was about the ripple effects that would touch every aspect of our lives for years to come. I realized that healing, if it was even possible, wouldn't come from her. It wouldn't come from apologies, promises, it had to come from me, from understanding, from reclaiming my identity, from rebuilding my sense of trust and self-worth. I had to navigate this minefield, not just to survive, but to eventually determine whether we could ever rebuild anything together. In the middle of this chaos, I started seeing patterns in human behavior I hadn't noticed before. Betrayal wasn't just a moral failure, it was a choice, a complex interplay of desire, opportunity, and self-deception. And the person betrayed me was left to pick up the pieces, to make sense of the senseless, and to decide whether to remain in the wreckage or to step away and forge a new path. Every day was a tightrope walk. One wrong step emotionally could collapse everything. One moment of softness could be mistaken for weakness. And yet I realized that I couldn't close myself off entirely, or I would lose not just my marriage, but the fallout forced me to confront who I was, what I valued, and how far I was willing to go to reclaim control over my life, over my emotions, over my future. By the end of that first month, I understood something crucial. The betrayal was not a singular moment, it was a continuous, evolving experience. It wasn't just her action, it was every lie, every omission, every intimate moment stolen. And the fallout wasn't just emotional, it was practical, relational, psychological. It had reshaped my world, And I had to learn to navigate this new terrain, one careful step at a time.
After weeks of waking up to the same ache, the same gnawing thought loops, I realized something. If I didn't do something, I would collapse under the weight of it all. I couldn't remain frozen, stuck between betrayal and hope, trapped in the endless echo of what she had done. Something had to change, and that change had to start with me. I began by reclaiming the spaces she had invaded with him. I moved out of the house, not because I was giving up, but because I needed to create distance, a buffer from the memories that threatened to drown me. Even the act of packing my things was cathartic. I handled each item deliberately, reliving the memories, but also rewriting them in my mind. That sweater she had worn on our first anniversary, I remembered it, yes, but I also remembered the moment I had bought it, the pride I felt picking it out for her. The bed? I didn't touch it, not yet. Some things had to remain sacred to my own memory, untouched by anger or betrayal. I began researching, quietly, almost obsessively. I read about emotional affairs, the psychology of betrayal, recovery after infidelity. I wanted to understand, to process, to prepare for the decisions I would have to make. And slowly, the clarity started to emerge. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't a victim without agency. I could reclaim my life with or without her. Therapy became a cornerstone, not just to vent or cry or process, but to strategize. My therapist helped me confront the emotional turmoil I had been suppressing, and in those sessions I realized something fundamental. I had been holding on not just to her but to the version of myself that existed before the betrayal. That version, trusting, patient, loyal, had been fractured. And if I wanted to heal, if I wanted to regain some sense of stability, I had to rebuild myself first. I started small. I re-established routines for me and the kids. I cooked meals, drove them to school, helped with homework, and tried to infuse those ordinary acts with intentionality. I wasn't just existing. I was reclaiming normalcy in the midst of chaos. And in those small moments, I felt something shift. The anger, the grief, the confusion, they were still there, but they were no longer paralyzing. They had become few. I also began confronting Julia, but carefully, strategically, not with rage or screaming, but with clear, deliberate conversations about boundaries. I made it explicit that the affair and the physical betrayal in our home had consequences. The house, the family, our trust. These weren't things that could be casually repaired with tears or notes. I demanded transparency, honesty, and accountability. She resisted at first, naturally, but I realized that in order to move forward, whether together or apart, I had to reclaim control over the rules of engagement. Emotionally, this was excruciating. There were nights I would lie awake imagining him, imagining what she had felt, imagining the intimacy I could never erase. It was a mental battlefield, but I learned to redirect that energy. I channeled my rage into action, my grief into reflection, my confusion into planning. I realized that reclaiming my agency wasn't about punishing her or him. It was about protecting my own mind, my own heart, my own future. I also started thinking about the moral implications. Revenge felt tempting, almost primal. I imagined confronting him publicly, exposing the betrayal, making him feel the shame I felt. But I knew that would only degrade me, tie me permanently to the pain. True transformation, I realized, came from acting with intention, rather than reaction. I had to rise above the base instincts and reclaim a sense of self-respect. Financially and legally, I took steps to protect myself. I consulted with lawyers, understood my rights, and started separating finances in a measured, careful way. I didn't want to be blindsided by impulsive decisions. This wasn't about vindictiveness. It was about ensuring that my life, my work, my future wasn't hijacked by the chaos of her choices. Meanwhile, I began rebuilding my internal narrative. I refused to be defined by what happened. Betrayal was not my identity. I was not the husband she cheated on. I was Michael Adams, father, professional, someone capable of enduring and acting despite immense pain. Slowly, I reclaimed pieces of myself I hadn't realized I had lost: my confidence, my autonomy, my self-respect. And then came the turning point. Julia reached out again, crying on the phone, saying she wanted us back, promising she would quit her job and rebuild. This time, I didn't react with immediate emotion. I listened, carefully, evaluating each word, each pause, each inflection. I realized that her timing, her sudden willingness to commit, was driven not by insight or remorse, but by the consequences of her own choices. She had gotten what she wanted from him: the intimacy, attention, validation, and now reality had caught up. I felt the sting, the bitterness, but I also recognized it for what it was: a decision point. I made it clear to her that reconciliation would not be simple, and it would not erase what happened. I set conditions: transparency, boundaries, therapy for both of us, and a long period of rebuilding trust. And I held firm. I didn't allow myself to be swept up by tears or promise. I had learned that love without boundaries was weakness. Forgiveness without accountability was self-destruction. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice a subtle transformation in myself. The rage was still there, but it was tempered by clarity. The grief was still there, but it was paired with resilience. I realized that the true turning of the tables wasn't about controlling her or punishing him. It was about reclaiming my power over my own life, emotions, and choices. I started reconnecting with friends, cautiously at first, sharing some of the truth, not to vent but to rebuild a support network. I felt a strange kind of relief in admitting the reality aloud, in having it witnessed by people who cared, who could provide perspective. I also began writing again, documenting everything, not just for proof, but as a form of therapy. I poured my pain, my anger, my reflections onto paper, letting it flow unfiltered, raw and real. Intimacy with Julia became a minefield of emotion. I realized I couldn't approach it the same way again. Every touch, every kiss, every hug carried the weight of what had happened. I had to reconstruct intimacy slowly, carefully, on my terms. And even then, I knew that some memories would never fade, some questions would never fully resolve, and some doubts would always linger. But I also realized that I didn't have to let those doubts dictate my entire experience. I could acknowledge them, work with them, and still rebuild connection where possible. The kids, thankfully, became my anchor. Lucy and Max didn't care about betrayal or timing or emotional calculus. They wanted their dad, their routines, their love. Providing that, showing up fully for them, became a source of purpose I hadn't anticipated. It reminded me that even in the darkest periods, life demands action, care, and presence. By taking deliberate steps, moving out, establishing boundaries, seeking therapy, reclaiming routines, protecting finances, and setting conditions for any potential reconciliation, I began to feel a sense of agency I hadn't known in months. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't a passive victim of betrayal. I was actively reclaiming my life, my mind, and my heart. And in that reclamation, something unexpected happened. I began to respect myself again. I began to see that survival wasn't just enduring, it was strategizing, acting, and refusing to let pain define my entire existence. I wasn't just surviving, I was transforming. By the time the first anniversary of that night rolled around, I had learned that turning the tables didn't mean controlling others. It meant controlling myself. It meant acting with intention, not reaction. It meant reclaiming my narrative, my dignity, and my future. And in that process, I realized the truth of what I had feared yet hoped for. That betrayal, no matter how deep, could be a crucible that forged resilience, clarity, and ultimately, self-mastery. The resolution didn't arrive with fireworks, or with a dramatic confrontation, or even a cathartic declaration. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between moments, the long, empty stretches of time where reflection replaced reaction, and understanding replaced chaos. By the time 6 months had passed since that night, I had moved into a small apartment not far from the kids' school. It was modest, nothing like the house Julia and I had shared, but it was mine, and that mattered more than I ever anticipated. Every morning, as I brewed coffee in the tiny kitchen, and listened to Lucy and Max laughing in the living room, I felt a quiet sense of control over my own life. It wasn't happiness in the conventional sense, but it was stability, and that felt like a victory in itself. Julia and I spoke regularly, carefully,
She kept her promises, at least externally. She quit her job at the firm that had monopolized her time and attention, started attending therapy with me, and tried in small, measurable ways to rebuild trust. I listened, I observed, and I evaluated. I realized early on that forgiveness couldn't be a transaction. It wasn't something you handed out because someone did everything right. Forgiveness had to be earned, gradually, through consistent actions that rebuilt what had been shattered. I watched her change, cautiously optimistic yet deeply wary. There were moments when her remorse seemed genuine, tears falling freely, vulnerability in her voice. And then there were moments when old patterns surfaced, defensiveness creeping back, small lies, small evasion. I learned to see both, to balance hope with skepticism, to allow room for human imperfection, while protecting my own heart. Physically, emotionally, and mentally, I was different now. The betrayal had carved out space within me for resilience I didn't know I possessed. I was sharper, more self-aware and more deliberate in my choices. I had learned that boundaries weren't just rules, they were lifelines. That love without respect, without accountability, was fragile and unsustainable. And that sometimes, the most radical act of self-preservation, was choosing not to let someone else's betrayal dictate the entirety of your life. The kids were my anchor. Through all of this, Lucy started sleeping better. Max stopped clinging in fear of unpredictability. I made it a point to create stability, routines, and safe spaces. We had movie nights, baking sessions, weekend trips to the coast. I realized that even as a family fractured in one sense, we could rebuild in another. The children didn't care about they didn't care about the timing, the heartbreak, or the moral calculus. They cared about love, presence, and care, and providing that became my mission, my source of grounding and purpose. As for Julia and me, we were no longer the same couple we had been. There was a distance, a subtle barrier that neither of us fully removed. It was a protective layer, a reminder that trust, once broken, cannot be seamlessly restored. But there was also growth, a new kind of intimacy built on honesty, deliberate care, and the shared acknowledgement of what had happened. We learned to laugh together again, to have conversations without tension, to reconnect in ways that didn't ignore the past, but integrated it as a cautionary memory. I also learned the importance of narrative, of reclaiming my story. I wrote extensively during this period, documenting the affair, my emotional journey, and the steps I took to reclaim control over my life. I didn't write for revenge, or to shame Julia, or even to relive the pain. I wrote to make sense of it, to externalize it, to transform chaos into clarity. Writing became a tool, a mirror, and a bridge to self-understanding. I occasionally thought about him, her AP, but those thoughts no longer held power over me. I realized that the rage I had once felt was a symptom of my own perceived helplessness. Once I acted, once I reclaimed agency over my own life, the obsession faded. I didn't need to confront him, to shame him, or to involve myself in his life. His role in the story was fixed, unchangeable, and ultimately irrelevant to my ongoing journey. The betrayal was hers, not his to continue defining for me. Socially, I began reconnecting with friends and colleagues. Slowly but intentionally, I stopped isolating myself. I realized that human connection, support, perspective, shared laughter, was essential in healing. I didn't need to explain the details to everyone, but having a circle that understood the weight of emotional pain, the challenge of forgiveness, and the need for deliberate action, made a difference. I began to understand that resilience isn't built in isolation, it's built through engagement, reflection, and the courage to keep moving forward, even when the past still aches. 6 months in, the first time I slept in my new apartment without waking in panic, without the images of betrayal haunting me, I felt a quiet sense of victory, not because everything was perfect, or because pain had vanished, but because I had endured, acted, and reclaimed the house, the bed, the intimacy. They were still memories, but they no longer had the power to dominate me. And then came the ultimate realization: I could love again, not blindly, not ignorantly, but fully, deliberately, and with boundary. I could forgive, not as an absolution of her actions, but as a gift to myself, freeing me from the chains of resentment. I could hope cautiously, not because it erased the past, but because it allowed the possibility of growth, change, and reconnection. The moment of truth arrived quietly, like a sunrise, Julia reached out one evening, after I had spent a weekend with the kids, and asked if we could talk, not about the affair, not about apologies, but about rebuilding our life together. I listened, measured, and realized that the decision was mine. I had been given a choice: continue in bitterness, allow betrayal to define me, or engage deliberately, with eyes wide open, and build something new. I chose the latter. We didn't rush. We didn't pretend that the past didn't exist. We faced it, discussed it, dissected it, and integrated it into a new version of our relationship. Some days were harder than others. Some nights, the memories still crept in, uninvited, but I had learned the tools, the strategies, the mindset to navigate those intrusions without being consumed. By the end of that year, our life felt different, yet familiar in some ways. We laughed more cautiously, loved more deliberately, and argued with awareness. The family unit, though tested, endured. I realized that betrayal had not broken me. It had forced me to confront everything I had ignored, everything I had suppressed, and everything I had failed to acknowledge about myself. In the end, the resolution wasn't cinematic or dramatic. There was no courtroom showdown, no public vindication, no grand declaration of triumph. The resolution was quiet, personal, and profoundly transformative. It was in reclaiming my agency, setting boundaries, engaging in deliberate reflection, rebuilding trust slowly, and choosing love with eyes wide open. Looking back, I understand now that betrayal, no matter how painful, can be a catalyst, not for destruction, but for growth. It forces confrontation with one's own vulnerabilities, values, and limits. It challenges assumptions and reshapes perspectives, and ultimately, it allows the possibility of transformation, of becoming stronger, clearer, and more deliberate in love and life. As I sit here now, years later, watching Lucy and Max play in the living room, hearing Julia laugh with them, I feel a bittersweet peace. I am not the same person I was before that night. I carry the scars, the memories, and the lessons, but I also carry resilience, clarity, and a deliberate sense of self. Betrayal cannot be undone, but the choices I made afterward defined the life I continue to live, a life shaped by pain, yes, but ultimately reclaimed, rebuilt, and in some ways, stronger than it ever was. The resolution is not perfection, it is endurance, it is clarity, it is deliberate action, and for me, after everything, that is enough.